Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today to join us. I'm Eric Cast. I'm the community manager here at Established. Today's webinar has been curated just for you and to help support our startup community. For those of you who are new to our community, Established is a consultancy that works with a diverse range of organizations on developing innovation strategies, ecosystem development, communications, and project event strategy and production. Our most known program is Startup of the Year, and hopefully most of you have heard of that one. Startup of the Year is a community, a resource, and awards program, all devoted on supporting and helping you, early stage founders. Which brings us to today. I would like to welcome Ubaldo Ciminieri, co-founder of InterviewIA, to the stage. Ubaldo, like I said, was the co-founder of InterviewIA, which is a SaaS interview collaboration platform for hiring that makes equitable and data-driven interviews consistent and repeatable. Welcome, Ubaldo.
Hello, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back with part of the community again. We were at the event in January in Tampa and got to meet a lot of you. So thank you very much. Sorry for this weird skylight lighting that's happening. I'm not in my normal office, but you can see me, so that's good. So thank you again. Let's dive in. Today we're talking about bias in hiring. So this is part one, and our focus as an organization. Let me. I think I need to swap views here. There you go. So our focus as an organization is to help companies really gain a better understanding of the biases that are at play, particularly in the hiring and interview process, because they are, and we're all human, and we weren't built to judge each other, so to speak, objectively in an interview. And so how do we, first of all, start to become more aware of the biases that are impacting our interview process, and how do we mitigate those, and how do we solve for those through some things that we'll talk about in part two. But we will talk about some of the common biases that are found in the interview process and how we solve for those in particular today. So I want to dive in first of all, and please be aware, I'd love this to be very interactive, and so I will be using the chat and asking people to participate, starting with an exercise that we do at InterviewIA with all of our team meetings. It's called the traffic light check-in. Here's a picture of our team, by the way. And we also have a team of developers in Bangalore, India, who we meet with as a team once a month. But the traffic light check-in is designed to give everybody an opportunity to check in and let the rest of the team know how they're doing mentally, because as I'm sure all of you are aware, we don't bring our full selves to work every day. Like, we're not 100% every day. It's just not possible, right? Everything from traffic to not getting good sleep the night before, all those things contribute. And then, more serious mental health issues contribute to that. And so what we want to do as a team, especially as a full team meeting, is understand where everybody's at for that day. And we do that by just giving a color, and you can see what the colors are related to here on the screen. And it really is an opportunity for everybody to share how they're doing without getting into the details of why they might be a certain color. And what's cool is, over time, we start to activate empathy, because we start to learn what different colors mean for each other, and then furthermore, how we can step up to help that person if they are a yellow or a red, for example. So it becomes really powerful in building empathy and in being able to adjust daily to still, because it's not like somebody who's red doesn't want to be included in, you know, the overall goals of the day, right? I mean, they still want to be a part of achieving those. So how do we recognize where people are at and help and adjust responsibilities and tasks to make sure that everybody is still helping us get to those daily goals, those weekly goals, whatever it is. But we're also honoring the fact that somebody's just having a rough day today, for example. So I want to throw that out to everybody and ask you to just in the chat to put your color. You know, it just helps me to understand where everybody's at, and kind of go from there. So I'll start. I'll just put my color here in the chat. So if everybody wants to kind of follow along, that would be awesome. There we go. Thank you. All right. Lots of greens, a yellow. Awesome. Okay. Cool. Well, thank you all. I appreciate that. Here is just some expectation setting. You know, we're here together for an hour. Let's be here in the moment. Let's participate. Realize this is a very safe space. You know, we're all in similar situations as founders and co-founders, and you know, startups are a tough life. And so know that this space is a place where you can share, you know, whatever it is based on what we're talking about today. But more importantly, be honest with yourself, because I think some of these things as it relate to bias are tough topics. You know, the last few years have shown us that bias is a very touchy word, and it shouldn't be. And I'll get into why and how we look at bias and how it helps us to better understand ourselves, and particularly how we, you know, interview people and consider people to bring into our startups, because those first few hires, as we know, are very critical. So we're going to start out with an exercise, and again, participate in the chat. But which one of these do you prefer? Classic or Kettle sea salt? Okay. Almost split down the middle. Kettle's a little bit ahead. What about this follow-up question? What is Serge does not like chips? Okay, that's fair. Totally fair. I grew up with classic, by the way, so I would normally gravitate towards classic. Let me ask you this question. Which of these is healthier for you? People are catching on. Yeah. And so here's the thing, you know, if you turn these bags around, they're pretty similar, right? Like they share the same health benefits or lack thereof, right? But we're often taught that this green organic sticker means healthy, right? We're often that's what marketing is all about, but that's what we've come to, you know, equate to health. And so this slide is just a starting point to say, you know what, we all have preconceived opinions about things. They're not necessarily based on facts. I like Lay's classics because that's what I grew up with, but I didn't really ever turn it around to look at the ingredients or the, you know, the facts about, you know, how healthy or not that it was for me. I just like Lay's. And so that's how bias starts. Here's another exercise. This one's a little more contentious. Apple or Android? Which one do you like? Oh boy. Okay. Pretty even crowd. For you Apple lovers, what are some words you would use to describe Android users? Stressful. Contrarian. Okay. Green bubble. There it is. Yep. What about you, Android users? How would you describe Apple users? Android doesn't play well with others. Okay. Well, yeah. So it's funny, you know, when in the many times elitist. Okay. Well, the many times, that we've done this, we've seen a lot of these words interchanged, actually. The main point here is that what we're doing now is we're taking our preconceived opinions about things and applying them to people. And that is where bias starts to become a little dangerous. So, for example, if I ask you who in this group is the CEO, most people would gravitate towards one or two characters in this list, right? Or if I asked, who's the most creative? Who would you say if I asked you that? Who's the most creative person out of this group? Yeah, purple hair. That's exactly what I gravitate towards. And so the problem is, that's where bias really can start to become dangerous, particularly when we're interviewing people, because we just make these kind of automatic assumptions about people mainly based on what they look like. So what we've got to do is we've got to be vulnerable with ourselves. We've got to start to self-reflect on our own opinions, our own perceived opinions and snap judgments. We really have to start to explore that. First of all, we have to be aware. So let's start there, because that once you're aware, you can't really forget, right? And so you kind of have to do something about it. So it's important to remember that awareness of the fact that we're all biased doesn't mean we're broken, just means that we're human. I mean, that's one of the main things that connects all of us. And so the more that you're aware, the more that you will be able to change how you think about the world and about other people. And you could start to make little changes to your behaviors. So before we jump in, I wanted to ask everybody real quick, what do you think has inspired this particular session, this webinar series, this topic? Why is it important for you? I'd love to hear from you. Okay, personal
I'll come
growth.
off mute and share if that's okay.
Yeah, please. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So my name is Tiffany, and I would say this session is really important to me as I'm thinking about building out our team currently. And just looking back over the years, it is very easy for bias to be a part of the recruitment process and not be fully aware of it. And I've seen it happen and play out time after time again. And so it's just been something that I want to continue to improve upon, and thinking about what are the tools and learning from other people's successes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And it's absolutely true. Anybody else? Well, I think Tiffany, I think you speak for a lot of us in recognizing that and taking wanting to take the steps to avoid that, because again, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we're all at critical stages in our startup journeys, and we've got these companies that are our babies, and if we're going to bring other people on to help us build that, we've got to be careful about that, right? And we've got to be really intentional and make sure that we're bringing on the right people. Because I think, as we all know from experience, when you bring on even just one wrong person for that role, it changes the dynamic of everybody in the organization, and you lose valuable time and money having to rectify that. So let's dive into, first of all, how do we get more curious? And what I mean by that is, how do we understand bias so that we can take a different approach to getting to know people better? And it starts with, again, really understanding where bias comes from. And so we built this, one of my partners in good, as I like to say, is a neuroscientist. And so we we come at this from how our brains work. And that's what we're going to talk about. So it starts with information overload, right? I mean, we all have an Apple or an Android mini computer that has access to anything you can think of in our hands at all times. And so what happens is we have all of this information flooding us. And as you can see from the numbers here, our eyes take in more than all of the other four senses combined. Take all that stuff in. So we're constantly getting information thrown at us from everywhere. And the thing is, our brains cannot possibly process all of that information. It's just not possible. They're just not built for that, at least at its base level, right? Think of a computer. I mean, it's computers, you know, they can't process. They only have a certain amount of memory, a certain amount of processing power. That's what our brains do. So the first thing is there's just so much information. We can't handle that. And we can't certainly process all of that information in a meaningful way. The second piece is our influences. You know, we have internal drivers. So if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we all have things inside of us that where we want to stay safe and healthy. We want to learn and grow. Those are parameters that define any of the information that does get processed in our brain. Those influences internally define how we look at those things. And then external influences, like the family we were born into, where we went to school, where we went to church, the community, all the places we visited. All of these things define for each of us parameters through which information gets processed. So now we're starting to define that information that's coming at us. And then we have this idea of instant categorization. So if you think back, you know, millions of years ago when humanity first started to evolve, Homo sapiens, cavemen and women, you know, there was this fight or flight, and it kept us alive, because we would see somebody, and what would happen is, right, you see somebody and you automatically have to ask yourself, are they safe or are they dangerous? We still do this today. And it's an instant categorization of somebody. And what happens is every time we do that, every time we make some kind of quick categorization or distinction, we create a file folder. So we put that person, for example, into a categorized file folder in our brains. So we have millions of file folders that have categories, but they don't necessarily have a lot of information in them, right? Like that, it's just, we instantly categorize and move on. And the reason we do that, the reason our brains do that, is because it feels good. And here's why. So first of all, what do you all see in this image? Feel free to just throw it in the chat. Sky bridge, person sitting on a tree limb, okay. Burning Man. Yeah, right. So I'm going to do what the brain does for you. Well, first of all, how does looking at an image like this typically make you feel? Agitated? Yeah, unsure, right. So I'm going to do what the brain does in those instances when we feel things like that. I'm going to clear it up for you. So people were on the right track, but there's this concept of uncertainty equals pain. And what I mean by that is that the same part of the brain that manages emotional and physical pain also manages those feelings that you mentioned: agitation, uncertainty, I'm unsure. But the brain just treats all of that as pain. And so what does the brain do? Its function is to make sure that we're not in pain. It doesn't want us to feel pain. It wants us to feel comfortable, right? And so what happens is when you see an image that's blurry like that, the brain will feed you a story to fill in the gaps that are making you feel uncomfortable. And that's why we come up with answers, Burning Man or person sitting on a tree limb. You know, the brain is making up these stories for us to make us feel better. So let's tie it all together. We've got that information overload. We've got our influences now that are defining for each of us how we're going to look at that information and process it. And then we've got that idea of instant categorization. So even though we're sort of defining how we look at it, a lot of the times that information is just getting categorized, but we're not really putting any more information behind it. And then you have this idea of uncertainty, and how the brain deals with that is creating false certainties and unconscious bias. That's where our biases come from, is this equation, if you will. Because again, at the end of the day, the brain wants us to feel comfortable. And when we're sitting across from somebody at an interview who doesn't look like us, they don't sound like us, etc., they didn't go to our school, we didn't like their handshake, right? Those all make us feel uncomfortable, which forces the brain then to instantly categorize that person. And then based on our influences and any other information or lack thereof, we make a determination about that person instantly. That's bias. That's what's happening. And so you can see that it's because it's instant. That's why we call it unconscious, right? It's not something we're intentionally doing, but we have to start to control it. And so that's where curiosity comes in. We've got to take those assumptions, those snap judgments, those determinations that we just instantly make about people, and we got to step back and understand, first of all, what triggers those for us, right? We've got to go back into our defining our parameters. Why do I love Lay's potato chips? Because I grew up with them. So from very little, that's just what I knew. And so I've got to understand why that is. And then I've got to go out and seek more information if I'm going to change my mind about why I like Lay's or why I shouldn't. You know, and one thing to remember is that bias is neither good nor bad. It's been made to feel negative. And I think, you know, when people get called biased, they take offense to that. But bias is not good or bad. In fact, it's how we've learned. You know, there are good biases. And so we've got to understand of our biases, which ones are good ones and which ones are bad, and how do we take control of the stories that right now we're letting our brains just automatically tell us to make us feel better. So that's going to involve some, you know, uncomfortableness intentionally to get past that as we learn new things, particularly about people who, again, don't fit our mold of comfort. Okay, so Jamila says, understanding our own biases requires self-awareness, which equals emotional intelligence. Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of that. It's a combination of empathy. You know, that there's a whole, empathy is a skill that we often talk about a lot, and then there's a spectrum of empathy that in conjunction with this self-awareness really helps us to intentionally decide if we're going to go learn more about other people, if we're going to have, you know, this higher emotional intelligence that lets us to get to know people, especially those people outside of our comfort zones. It's all of that, and it takes practice, right? This isn't something that's just going to turn on and go, but it starts with that awareness. Any other questions or comments? Please feel free to throw those in the chat before we move on. I like that, Jamila. Practice makes permanent. I hope I'm saying that name correctly, Jamila. Jamila. Oh, cool. All right, Jamila. Thank you. Any questions about the bias stuff or any thoughts before we move on? All right, let's move on, and then we'll have I think a Q&A at the end here and kind of a wrap up. So let's now talk about the status quo of hiring. And what we mean by that is that the process of hiring, the process of interviewing hasn't changed in over 100 years. You know, just the general process of interviewing. And it started with Thomas Edison. He was really the sort of the father of kind of the modern interview as we know it. And why that is because when he was hiring for lab assistants, he would present every candidate with a bowl of soup. And if a candidate decided to season their bowl of soup before tasting it, he would immediately dismiss them from the candidate process. He just felt like they were going to be innovation killers, right? He didn't, because they weren't willing to test and then season, and so he was basically making an assumption on one thing, one action, one behavior, and dismissing them completely from the process. And so we still hire like that today, right? Like somebody comes in, we shake their hand, or they're wearing funny clothes, or they don't look like us, or whatever. Our brain instantly makes a judgment about them. And more often than not, what we spend our time in the interview doing is just justifying that judgment that we've already made, right? And it's one thing. And so it's important to realize that is still at play even 100+ years later. So let me ask you this question, kind of a level set. Does your current hiring process reward job seekers who play the game? Because it is kind of a game, you know? So these are just questions for you to think about. Are all hiring managers in your organization, oftentimes as startup founders, it's us, right? Are we confident in our hiring process? Does our process prevent that ad hoc or loophole hiring, you know, where we decide to hire somebody and bypass everything because, you know, maybe they came through our network or from a friend, right? Or something like that, a referral. And are your hiring managers, are you conscious of preventing bias at each step? All right, we've got to understand and look at our hiring process in this way and ask ourselves these questions so that we can start to do better. So now I'm going to go into kind of the 5 most common biases and myths of the interview process, starting with in-group bias. And the myth is that we will hire the most qualified candidate. This goes back to that, again, that idea that our brains want us to be comfortable, right? And the parameters, you know, that our influences have set for us really drive home towards in-group bias. In-groups are people we surround ourselves with because they make us comfortable. And often that's friends and family. Often that's people who look like us and sound like us. And so we, in the interview process, tend to give the benefit of the doubt to people who are like us in some way, even if it's something simple like, oh, you like to drink beer? So do I. Great. We're going to get along great. But again, we end up forcing all the other candidates to prove themselves beyond a reasonable doubt, because technically we've already made up our mind about who we're going to hire. And so the truth is that we will hire the person who is most like us, who makes us feel most comfortable, even though they might not be the most qualified. Does anybody have experience with that or story they want to share related to myth number 1? And feel free to come off mute too if you want. All right, we'll keep moving on. If you do, feel free again to kind of throw something in the chat there. The second myth is, you know, recall bias. This is a big one because often, you know, interviewers are scrambling to take notes, or they're not, and they're taking notes a week later, well, what happens? A week later, you're only going to remember what you liked about that person. You're going to remember the story, not the lesson. You know, we always say, take the lesson, leave the story. Well, the story is that they like to drink beer, or they went to my school, or they like to snowboard, or whatever it is. It's so much easier to remember those things, again, because those things make us feel comfortable. And so even if we're taking notes, you know, even an hour later, we're going to remember those types of things because that's familiar to us, that makes us feel comfortable. So that's the second and probably the biggest bias that's at play, is recall bias in terms of how we're evaluating candidates. This takes the equitable evaluation piece out of the interview. Myth number 3 is we often, as interviewers, believe that, oh, the candidates are just so nervous during the interview, right? When in reality, studies have shown that interviewers' heart rates are way higher during interviews. You know, I think there's this misconception that, you know, the weight of the world is on the candidate, when in reality, if you think about it, interviewers are tasked with hiring for their company. They're tasked with bringing in new people to build their team to hopefully build a successful company. And oftentimes they have to do that without any training, without any resources, just solely based on their gut. So if they're that stressed, that the brain's just like, oh, you're in pain, I'm going to ease that and make this a lot easier for you. Go with this. And that's how we hire. And so we tend to favor people. And so the system justification bias is, it's, if we think about it this way, is we're going to favor those candidates who essentially kind of know how to play the game, who seem to be more comfortable in the interview, which then makes us feel comfortable that we're making the right decision about them, right? So it's those people who can interview well. Doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they're the best candidate, but man, they interviewed so great and they were just so smooth and they answered every question without, you know, taking a breath or whatever. That makes us feel comfortable, and that is then a justification for putting them at the head of the candidate pool pack, so to speak. Myth number 4, kind of continuing along that, is this idea of halo effect. So they perform perfectly in the interview, right? They presented a pristine looking resume. Their application was perfect, right? All the punctuations were perfect, spot on. We often tend to think then that just because they performed well in the interview, that they're going to perform great at everything else they do. And that's just not true. But that's the halo effect, right? We put that halo on those candidates who, again, they're just so smooth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the right person for your role. They just knew how to give a good interview. You know, salespeople are salespeople for a reason. So we've got to be able to evaluate them in different ways, not just based on how well they do in an interview. And the 5th myth that often occurs is this idea of groupthink bias, that the hiring team should all agree on who gets hired. I mean, yes, we should all accept, obviously, the decision as a team, but what groupthink bias is when we all sit down for that debrief and someone comes in, and often it's someone in a position of power, the hiring manager or an executive comes in and says, you know what, I like that candidate. That's a problem, because now what happens is the rest of the team then just sort of falls in line with that decision. Their thoughts, their perspective doesn't get included in the final decision-making effort for the hire. And so we've to avoid groupthink, we really, and we'll get into solutioning here, but to avoid groupthink is to give power and voice to every single person who was involved in the interview process, and to give equal weight to that, so that we can, at the end of the day, look at everybody's information, all the relevant data, and we can look at it in a way that we can compare all the candidates equally and make a data-driven decision, not just because the loudest person in the room said we're hiring that person. And so what often are the outcomes when we let those biases manipulate our interview process and our hiring process? One, we're going to hire people who are really good at manipulating your bias. They're really good at making you feel comfortable. And but at the end of the day, it's like a 50-50 coin flip of whether they're going to be great in the role that you're hiring them for. We don't know. We just felt comfortable around them. And we lose access to people from marginalized backgrounds, from underrepresented groups of people, because, and you know, there's concepts of hierarchy, power, status, things that people in underrepresented groups and communities, they don't learn, right? They don't learn how to embrace power or accept status. They don't learn about manipulating bias. And so, you know, in this way, in an interview, and so they don't perform as well according to our bias. Again, right, they don't make us feel comfortable. And so we often don't hire more diverse people because they don't make us feel comfortable. So that's kind of the level set here of what these biases can do, how they can impact your growth as a company, especially as a startup. Any questions on those biases? Any stories you want to share? I know Tiffany, you shared a story, or why you moved on to a certain party. Do you want to talk about that, Tiffany?
Yes, I can speak to that briefly. I just, so maybe about in around 2014, I started experimenting with having a practicum or
Okay.
some type of application. And that's just because I realized that the company I was with at the time was an ed tech company, and we would get candidates, they look great on paper, look great on paper, could come in, you know, they did the prep, right?
Right.
However, when it came down, we would get some folks that they do well in those phases, but when it came down to actually the position itself, it's like, well, what happened to this person that we
Right.
bring it into the team?
You're like
This person's not the
blindsided.
right fit. So I started doing an application because, one, we were missing great candidates that maybe they didn't look all wonderful and pristine on paper. They might didn't speak the lingo that sounds really articulate the way people think that is, but boy, they knew the work and they could do it. And so by having that, adding that application phase, like, show me what you know. I'm not interested, like, however you learned it is how you learned it, because people also may have just done being in the field, right? But it's hard to capture that in a resume sometimes. So by having that application, we actually improved our team tremendously. And our team also started to look more like the community that we're operating in, because we realized that a lot of people had gained skills in more informal pathways, and they could demonstrate the knowledge and the skills and the experience, but in those traditional formats, they're not really structured in a way to capture and to tell their story. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, and it's a great segue into the solutioning part of this. So we'll talk about essentially everything that you're kind of doing as ways to solve for these. So how do we solve for the in-group bias? And these are just some ideas. There's also technology out there that does some of this. I'm not a huge fan of AI-driven tech that replaces where a human should be in the process. But when looking at resumes and things like that, it's as long as you're defining or predefining what you're looking for, right? Then you can pick out the relevant data off a resume that truly matters. I think often people look at a resume and that's that first point where they're like, yay or nay, based on, maybe they had a year gap in their work history. Is that relevant? We don't, you have to define those things, but that's often where the idea, this dismissal of truly qualified candidates starts to happen. So to prevent in-group bias, we have to stop looking and associating information on somebody's resume with what we like, what we think is right. Oh, they went to my school, or oh, they have at least 3 years of experience. Do they really need that? Right? We don't know unless we define it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Most of the time, those are just magic numbers that we make up just to say, like, if you don't hit that threshold of 3 years, then you're automatically dismissed. The other thing too is to avoid chit chat in an interview. And what we mean by that is, sure, we want to establish rapport kind of right up front, talk about the weather, whatever, but that chit chat shouldn't be part of the data gathering of the interview. But often it becomes relevant because, again, that's where we find out if we're going to like somebody or not right away. And that just automatically makes up our mind about them without even getting into the interview questions. So avoid chit chat, avoid documenting or taking that information that you get out of simple chit chat at the beginning of an interview. Avoid putting that into what should be just the relevant data related to what we're looking for. And what you'll find is if you're focused solely on that relevant data, then you will find the most qualified candidate more often than not. The second solution is then documentation of all that, right? So to prevent recall bias, what we're saying is to document everything during the interview in real time. And I know that seems hard. And again, that's where maybe technology can help. And part two is we're going to show you how our tech kind of helps that. But ultimately, if you can find a way to document the relevant information from a candidate during the interview, then you don't have to worry about remembering what happened a week later. And you can make a consistent, defensible, and equitable hiring decision every time because you've done that with every candidate. And you're not going back and trying to remember things. So documenting in real time really solves for this problem of recall bias. Preventing system justification bias. Structure. If you create a structured interview process that every interviewer can feel absolutely confident about and not feel stressed about, that guides them through every step of the process, then they won't be surprised, right? There won't be any points throughout the process where they're going to feel like they failed. And what you'll start to see is that if you provide that guide, that structured interview process for them, you'll start to see consistency across your teams and across your organizations. And you'll start to see better outcomes. You'll be able to repeat that process many, many times. And that's where you can really start to see some gains as an organization, because we're taking that stress off of every interviewer to feel like they've got to come up with the answers or they even have to come up with the questions. It's all about structuring and predefining everything so that then the conversation between an interviewer and a candidate can be just that, a really great conversation, guided by what I know I need to listen for, and go. How do we prevent the halo effect? So this is, again, going back to how you prepare for the interview process and how you define exactly what it is you're looking for, and even what you're not looking for, right? So if things like charisma and attention to detail and writing a great resume, if those are things that actually pertain or are required to a job, then put that in there, right? Define that. Find questions that will help you get at whether a candidate has those things or not. But if they don't matter, then why should they ever be involved in the decision-making process of that candidate and whether they should be hired or not? What are the critical skills and behaviors that you know equate to success for somebody in a role? Define those out, find questions to correlate, and go. Otherwise, just don't worry about some of those things that don't matter. It shouldn't matter whether somebody likes beer or not, right? And so how do we evaluate candidates in the right way for their ability to do their job, for their alignment to our company, our mission, our vision, our values, our team, their manager, for their growth potential, really, which those should be the three main areas that we look for. And then finally, how do we prevent groupthink? This goes back to documentation, and this goes back to how we're sharing and securing all the candidate data and how we're accessing all of that candidate data throughout the process, but giving voice, making sure that every interviewer's voice is heard throughout the process. And then, really having that information come together in a way that we can look at every candidate and stack and rank them accordingly based on scoring and things like that is a great way to avoid groupthink, because now it's not about someone just coming in with the loudest voice saying we're hiring that person. It's about what the data says. And the more data we have, the more relevant data we have to help us make that decision, the better we're going to feel about that decision. And we can defend it. Okay, one parting thought for today. Companies really need to take responsibility here. I think there's a lot of onus put on candidates to perform in the interview process, but often they're scored or they're impacted in a negative way by the fact that the hiring process of a company is broken. They don't even know what they're looking for or how to get at what they're looking for. So companies have to really, especially now, 2 years after COVID, after George Floyd's murder, when talent is in control and candidates or companies are desperate to hire, they have to fix their hiring process. And we can, by starting with those 5 bias manipulations within the interview process, and really building a more structured and equitable interview process from the start. So let's open it up. I would love to hear from you. Questions, thoughts, what did you learn today, etc.
I actually had a question.
Please,
I'd like to ask. So it's not exactly on topic with the kind of bias you were talking about, but the bias of understanding your worth in terms of salary and not having transparency into what a role commands or you should expect. Yeah. And the idea that you could walk in there not knowing what they're offering and completely leave a ton of value on the table that you're worth, just not knowing what the reality is. How can people putting jobs opportunities out there do better, and how can you as a candidate kind of protect yourself from situations like that?
Yeah, I mean it's the tough question. I mean, I think so from the company side, where having a more structured interview process helps is once you've defined all the questions you're going to ask based on the traits and skills and behaviors that you need, right, that are required for the role. Once you have all that built out, it should become really easy to build out a job description that is super clear and honest, right? It's here are the things we're looking for, here are the things we don't want. And I think we need to take a step forward from a job description perspective and start to rethink job descriptions. Because right now it's copy and paste, right? And you just throw a job description out there. They all look the same. Instead, what we need hiring companies need to do is really truly say, this is what we're looking for from a culture perspective for the job. This is what's required. Here's what we're not looking for. If you fit all this in some way, shape, or form, apply. Let's give the candidates an opportunity to self-select in or out of that process by being very clear about what we're looking for. From a candidate perspective, yeah, I mean, I think it takes research, and then, as you get to things like salary and things like that, I think it's absolutely crucial to sort of do that research and understanding of what you're worth. It's a little interesting now because with work being remote, oftentimes salary was sort of based on where you were. So it's a little different. And I think that's where, again, it's on companies to understand if they're going to go fully remote or, agree to hire from anywhere now, then they've got to understand what they're willing to pay based on where somebody is. So that whole conversation takes a lot of research and understanding about the current labor market, where people are, because a lot of people are moving out of city centers. They're not going to go into offices. So we got to take all those things into consideration. And I think candidates should do their homework and, look into that as well. Like, what am I worth? And don't be afraid to say that and look for that. Yeah. So, but it's, that it's tough. It's kind of based on company, based on what they're hiring for, where they're hiring, et cetera. But it takes, it's still, right? It's data. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of data and understanding of what you're looking for and why you're looking for it from both sides of the interview table.
And tying that back to bias in a maybe a simpler way is, do you pay more for someone that has an advanced degree, whether or not that the person who doesn't have the advanced degree has the experience and is a better candidate in other metrics? Does that yield more? Should it? What's the difference? Really?
I don't know. Again, it's a great question. I think you have to define whether an advanced degree is required or not. And I think a lot of companies are dealing with that right now, right? Is a degree even required for this? And oftentimes I think they're finding out that no, but you have to define it. I think about Harvard, right? Like, oh, well, we need to hire people from Harvard. Well, if you can define a business reason for that, which often is that, oh, well, people who went to Harvard, we want to get at their network, right? So if you can define that as a business reason of why you want to hire somebody from Harvard, then I say go for it. Mm-hmm. And to your point, yeah, maybe, you might have to be willing to pay a little bit more for that. But again, I think it depends on how you're defining whether you need that or not. And if you don't need it, then it shouldn't be a question. It shouldn't be something you have to deal with.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Tiffany, I appreciate your comment, yeah, I mean, this is a two-way street, right? We want candidates to look at us and understand who we are. And because we're obviously hiring companies are assessing them. And so I think it's very much because at the end of the day, we want people to find meaningful work, and we as hiring companies want to find people who are looking for meaningful work who align with what we're trying to accomplish. And so it's got to be that conversation, that back and forth conversation. Anybody else?
This was a great conversation, especially about the different types of bias and unconscious bias confirmation and all that. One of the things that I had I've seen in the past and I've heard, others discuss was come down to the actual questions during the interview, right? We can unconsciously interject bias into how we write out these questions and how we ask them as well, because there's also an emotional bias that we'll interject with. And when you do, let's say in part of your interview process, it involves multiple people, how do you standardize how do you, one, remove the bias from that language of those questions and become a neutral emotional person and apply that to everybody? Because what one
Yeah.
person, everybody's going to be at their own angle, right? And what they want to understand and know. But that also introduces more risk for bias to occur. Any tips on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think again, it starts with that list of skills and behaviors and competencies that are required, right? That equal success for somebody who's in that role. So if you have that list, then you can, it's more easy to go find questions and define indicators based on that list. And so then, our recommendation too is, so like, let's say you have 9 of those, right? Required traits. We recommend that every interview should really focus on 2 to 3 of those at a time. So that equals what? 3 to 4 interviews. That's a 3 to 4 interview round process to help you figure out if candidates have those 9 things. And you can break those up by the intent of each interview. Pre-screen, it might be just general, like, do they have the ability? Do they have the skills? Then a deep dive is more deeper skills and ability and alignment. Do they align with our company culture and our team and all that? And then finally, it's growth. Like, are they going to be here with us for a while? Do they have a potential to grow with us as we grow? And so it really, it goes back to that structure and identifying exactly what we're looking for, and then testing that. It's not going to be right the first time. So if you can have data that tells you whether you're asking the right questions or not, and whether you have the right interviewers in play, that becomes very powerful, so that you can continuously improve that process to the point where now we know that for every salesperson, it takes us 2 interviews with these questions and these interviewers. Boom. And we can see that now we're hiring the right salespeople repeatedly. But it takes a little bit of time to get there, but that's kind of where you start, is that structure, that definition of what it is you're looking for.
Great. Yeah. Now, do you think it's possible to completely remove bias from this process?
Yeah, I mean, again, no. I mean, it'll always be there, but again, I think we can put constraints around it and define, because again, those indicators that you're predefining for every question, those are good biases. Those are the things that we know we are looking for as a company, and that's okay. Because that's what we're putting that down. We're saying that that's what we're looking for, and that is okay. And so, yeah, no, you're never going to lose it. You're never going to get rid of it, but we can certainly redefine it and mitigate those biases that are always going to cause a problem.
Okay, yeah, totally agree. Because like you mentioned earlier, we form these biases over years of learning.
Right.
It's our immediate worldview and our extended worldview that form these biases from infancy until today, right? And
Exactly.
so it's really hard to combat those and mitigate them and change them.
Yeah.
And we could really dive into the psychology behind all that, and I would love to, but we don't have time.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the biases, they're cemented to a degree, and the only way to really unfreeze them and change them is by doing some self-reflection, having some self-awareness that you have these biases, and that you need to pay attention to them. You bring them to the surface. When everything's to the surface, you know about them.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Takes work, takes awareness, and takes curiosity. I just real quick before people start jumping off, I put in the chat. So we're offering 5 free license bundles to companies on our platform, and I'm going to use the platform for the next part 2 of this series, just as a guide for us in the conversation to talk about how we're going to start, how we can interview better, how we can build more structured interviews. And so if people want to go sign up and kind of play around in there, you know, they might be ready a little bit more prepared for part 2 in understanding how we think about and go about helping companies build more structured, more confident, more equitable interview processes.
Sounds awesome. I hope everybody takes advantage of it. But we are at time for our webinar today. I want to be conscious of everybody's time and, you know, make sure we're not taken away. Everybody who joined us today, thank you so much for doing so. Thank you for being you. Thank you for doing what you do every day. It's important that we acknowledge that. Coming up in a couple weeks, Ubaldo's already mentioned it. We're going to have another webinar series, part 2, focused on the interview process itself. So please be on the lookout for the emails and notifications for that next webinar. If you want to learn more about Startup of the Year, please go to startupofyear.com and check it out. Also, please check out InterviewIA. It's an awesome product. Ubaldo is an awesome individual to talk to. Jump on it and use it, leverage it. Anything that helps you and makes you better. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.